You, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear.
You will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Harry S. Truman had always believed in a high amount of civilian leadership in the military, and thus made many tactical and policy decisions based on the recommendations of his advisors.
I call upon all Americans to help me keep our nation united in defense of those ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt.
When Harry Truman became president, he had to pick up where Roosevelt had left off. Truman was yet unaware of the development of nuclear weapons, and soon ending World War II would be his problem to solve.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
His decision to use 2 nuclear bombs against Japan was not an easy one, but it was deemed necessary to prevent more casualties. The American people expected the war to end as FDR had promised, and so Truman had to stand by that promise. As Commander-in-Chief, Truman exercised his power granted under the U.S. Constitution to command and direct the military, and so 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in early August 1945. However, wartime alliance with the Soviet Union became peacetime opposition, and the Cold War began. Truman's next role as Commander-in-Chief was during the Korean War, during which the North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, as the first significant armed conflict of the Cold War. Without consulting Congress, as he believed most legislators supported his position, Truman promptly urged the newly formed United Nations to send troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Truman believed that the conflict, if left unchecked, would start a chain reaction that would destroy the United Nations, furthering communist aggression elsewhere. At that time, U.S. policy was containment, so while Truman sought to contain communism within the 38th parallel of the Korean Peninsula, MacArthur sought to oust communism once and for all in Korea and neighboring China. Despite MacArthur's popularity among the American public from World War II and some surprising victories in Korea, Truman exercised his right to choose a general and a military policy by firing MacArthur due to differing views. Truman's exclusion of Congress in approval of his military decisions and the firing of a popular general caused his approval ratings to plummet in both D.C. and the public. Even though Congress failed to check his power, the judiciary branch was able to limit Truman's war power. When Truman attempted to seize steel mills, believing it would avert a strike that would have imperiled the war effort in Korea, the Supreme Court overruled him in a vote of 5-4 to reverse his seizure. This would be one of the few times Truman had checks on his military power.
I have nothing to conceal. We are proud of our record.
However, since from the Korean War, the Constitution has been interpreted to mean the President may act with essentially a free hand in foreign and military affairs. Although Congress has the power to declare war, Truman's presidency has shown that with advisory, the Commander-in-Chief also has relative power over U.S. military, whether it be authorizing appointed military operations or firing of a military officer.
Truman started his presidency with not only the task of ending World War II, but also preventing a war with Russia. He solved both problems with the atomic bombs, which finally convinced Japan to surrender and showed Russia that the U.S. was willing and able to use nuclear weapons. In this case, as in the Korean War, Truman used his power as Commander-in-Chief to further his diplomatic agenda.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
In the wake of World War II, Harry Truman accomplished one of his greatest feats in foreign policy. He negotiated and convinced the Senate to ratify the United Nations Charter. In 1949, Truman also negotiated a military treaty with other Western nations in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Today, the United States, keenly aware of its strategic role as a leader in the free world, has allied itself with other nations, dedicated to the preservation of peace and the welfare of mankind.
In addition to treaties, Truman implemented two strong foreign policies during the Cold War, which together helped block the expansion of the Soviet Union. The first policy, known as the Marshall Plan after Secretary of State George Marshall, successfully revitalized the economies of Western Europe through nearly $13 billion in aid. The second, known as the Truman Doctrine, aided nations such as Turkey and Greece in the fight against the Soviet Union and communism.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure.
Both plans required immense funding from Congress, which Truman secured in part because of the overwhelming public support for efforts opposing communism. Although the framers of the Constitution intended the President to carry out the orders of Congress, for foreign affairs, Congress generally carried out Truman's orders, so Truman's power as chief diplomat went largely unchecked.
The Democratic Party in general performed poorly in most, but not all, the elections during Truman's presidency. Truman's first midterm election resulted in the largest Democratic defeat since the 1928 pro-Republican wave that elected Herbert Hoover. In the House of Representatives, the Republicans picked up 55 seats and took a majority. This ended the 14 years of Democratic control in the House. Similarly, Republicans picked up 12 seats in the Senate, where the Democrats lost 11. The vote was largely seen as a referendum on Truman, whose approval rating had shrunk to 32% over the president's controversial handling of the wave of post-war labor strikes, such as the nationwide railroad strike in May, at a time when Americans depended on railroad service for both commuters and long-distance travel. For the first time since before the Great Depression, Republicans were seen as the party which could best handle the American economy. The election clearly demonstrated that Truman could not replicate his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's success as a party leader. In the 1948 presidential election, Truman emerged with the surprise victory over Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey. Truman had campaigned against the obstructionist Congress, which had blocked many of his initiatives and created an unproductive image of his opposition.
I am therefore calling this Congress back into session on the 26th of July.
In addition, the U.S. economy recovered from its post-war recession of 1946 and 1947, just in time for Election Day. Truman's feisty campaign style energized his base traditional Democrats, most of the white South, Catholic Jewish voters, and, in surprise, the Midwestern farmers. This coinciding with the presidential election, the Democrats both won seats in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, the Democrats gained 9 seats, enough to give them a majority. The Democratic Party also won 75 seats in the House, giving them a majority again. Truman's election confirmed the Democratic Party's status as the nation's majority party. The 1948 election stands as the one instance Truman succeeded as party leader. Fast forward to 1950, where Truman's approval rating was plummeting once again, and the Korean War was beginning. This unpopularity extended to the rest of the Democratic Party, which also faced heat, the escalation of the Cold War in general, and a severe recession in 1948. This unpopularity extended to the rest of the Democratic Party, which also faced heat, the escalation of the Cold War in general, and a severe recession in 1948. In the midterm election, the Democrats lost 5 seats to the Republicans and only barely maintained control of the Senate, with 49 seats to 47. The story was the same in the House, where the Democratic Party lost 28 seats while still maintaining a lead of 235 seats to 199. Abysmal approval ratings convinced Truman not to run for a second term. Truman's unpopularity, mainly due to the uneasiness because of the Korean War, resulted in the Democratic Party losing the majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. As Eisenhower won the presidency, the Republican Party won 22 seats in the House. This gave them the majority over the Democrats. The Democrats only lost 2 seats in the Senate, leaving them at 47 seats.
Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution gives vague instructions that instruct the President to take care that laws are faithfully executed. An executive order's purpose is to manage the operations within a federal government and have the full force of the law, and they don't necessarily need to have the approval of Congress. As the new chief executive after Franklin Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman executed a total of 896 executive orders. During post-war times, the U.S. military was low on essential resources like steel and coal, so Truman passed Executive Order 9548 in 1945. As unpopular as it was with local coal miners, it was allowed because of the War Labor Disputes Act of 1943. Act was vetoed by Roosevelt but overturned by Congress and created in response to 400,000 coal miners whose wages were significantly lowered due to wartime inflation. The order, with much criticism, allowed the federal government to put any coal mines under federal control as needed.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Executive orders do not have to stand alone. One of Truman's more known executive orders was Executive Order 9981, which ended racial discrimination in the U.S. militia. It was created to further enforce an executive order carried out, though not taken seriously, by Franklin Roosevelt, Executive Order 8802. This order was carried out in 1948, about 20 years before the Civil Rights Movement began. Along with ending racial discrimination, it also established the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. With a decreased number of able-bodied white men after World War II, 9981 came in handy when the Korean War erupted and the United States was in need of men.
So, do we think Truman's presidency was imperial or not?
Well, as far as a party leader, I don't think he was imperial. Even though a lot of his policies, he tried to exercise a lot of power. He couldn't really effectively do that as far as giving the Democratic Party a lot of power to get all of his legislation passed, because he wasn't very popular, and the public generally disapproved of his actions. So the fact that the Democrats lost a lot of those elections shows that he couldn't really be imperial in that sense.
I think that was a lot, though, because he focused so much on foreign policy. He was imperial in his foreign policy, where he had the Korean War, he ended World War II with the atomic bombs. He showed more power in creating treaties and getting the Senate to sign them than previous presidents, such as Woodrow Wilson, who couldn't get the League of Nations to be signed. But we got the UN and NATO during Truman.
Yeah, and as commander-in-chief, it was also a imperial presidency because he's the one who made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, and then he didn't ask for permission from Congress to send troops over in Korea, and like all of these things with World War II and things happening in the Cold War, he really did not get approval from Congress or anything. There was no checks on his decisions.
Yeah, especially with his executive orders, a lot of them were passed without Congress's blessing, so to speak. And some of them were beneficial to the people, but sometimes the people were also unhappy with the orders he passed. And I mean, as an imperial power, I think having control over the masses, whether they like it or not, is characteristic of that.
Mm-hmm. So overall, we could say that he is a pretty imperial president, and he won't have a lot of power as president.
Yeah.
Yeah.